Good day, everyone. I am Laika Sarem, and together with me are my co-reporters, Ms. Guriel Kristen Kay and Mr. Kanyal Nathaniel. So we are tasked to enumerate and discuss neoliberalism, myth, and Vita Active using Zoom application. So without further ado, we will now move to our discussion. So our first topic is neoliberalism. So what is neoliberalism? Next slide, please. So neoliberalism is a 20th century resurgence of the 19th century ideas associated with economic liberalism and free market capitalism. So it is generally associated with policies of economic liberalization, including privatization, deregularization, globalization, free trade, austerity, and reductions in government spending in order to increase the role of the private sector in the economy and society. However, the defining features of neoliberalism in both thought and practice have been the subject of substantial scholarly debate. So in policy making, neoliberalism was part of a paradigm shift away from the prevailing Keynesian economic consensus that existed prior to the persistent stagflation of the 1970s. So English speakers have used the term neoliberalism since the start of the 20th century with different meanings, but it became more prevalent in its current meaning in the 1970s and 1980s, used by scholars in a wide variety of social sciences as well as by critics. So next slide, please. Under neoliberalism, we have colonial and neoliberal architecture. So the theme of this year's 16th Venice International Architecture Exhibition is free space. Free space encompasses freedom to imagine the free space of time and memory, binding past, present, and future together, building and inherited cultural layers, weaving the archaic with the contemporary. So according to creators, free space can be a space for opportunity, a democratic space and programmed and free for uses not yet conceived. So there is an exchange between people and buildings that happens even if not intended or designed. So buildings themselves find ways of sharing and engaging with people over time. Long after the architect has left the scene, architecture has an active as well as in a passive life. So next slide, please. So we have now an animated introduction to Roland Barthes' mythology and how he used semiotics to decode popular culture. So in 1979, French theorist Jean-François Lyotard declared the end of all grand narratives, every theory or intellectual system, as Blackwell's dictionary defines the term, which attempts to provide a comprehensive explanation of human experience and knowledge. Next slide, please. So we have now the aura by Walter Benjamin. So the term was used by Walter Benjamin in his influential 1936 essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical. So Benjamin argued that even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element. So its presence in time and space, its unique existence, and the place where it happens to be. So he referred this unique cultural context as a presence in time and space as its aura. Next slide, please. So we have now biopolitics and necropolitics. So we will first discuss biopolitics. So biopolitics is a political wisdom taking into consideration the administration of life and the locality's populations as its subject. So to quote Michael Foucault, it is to ensure, sustain, and multiply life to put this life in order. So necropolitics is the use of social and political power to dictate how some people may live and how some must die. So biopolitics is an intersectional field between human biology and politics. So it is a political wisdom, as what I've said, while the necropolitics is the social and political power. Next slide, please. So I guess that's the end of my discussion about the neoliberalism. So I will now give the virtual platform to Ms. Gruyal for her discussion about myth. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Laika Sarin. And now let us proceed to myth. So by the way, I am Grial Christine KL. So next slide, please. So first, let us define what is a myth. So a myth is a symbolic narrative usually of unknown origin and at least partly traditional, that ostensibly relates actual events and that is especially associated with religious belief. It is distinguished from symbolic behavior and symbolic places or objects. Another definition of a myth is myths are specific accounts of gods or superhuman beings involved in extraordinary events or circumstances in a time that is unspecified but which is understood as existing apart from ordinary human experience. The term mythology denotes both the study of myth and the body of myths belonging to a particular religious tradition. So next slide, please. So the word myth derives from the Greek mythos, which has a range of meanings from word to saying and story to fiction. The unquestioned validity of mythos can be constructed with logos, the word whose validity or truth can be argued and demonstrated. Because myths narrate fantastic events with no attempt at proof, it is sometimes assumed that they are simply stories with no factual basis, and the word has become a synonym for falsehood or, at best, misconception. In the study of religion, however, it is important to distinguish between myths and stories that are merely untrue. So next slide, please. So what is the relation of myths to other narrative forms? So in Western culture, there are a number of literary or narrative genres that scholars have related in different ways to myths. So examples are fables, fairy tales, folk tales, sagas, epics, legends, and fables. Another form of tale, the parable, differs from myth in its purpose and characters. Even in the West, however, there is no agreed definition of any of these genres, and some scholars question whether multiplying categories of narrative is helpful at all, as opposed to working with a very general concept such as the traditional tale. Non-Western cultures apply classifications that are different both from the Western categories and from one another. Most, however, make a basic distinction between true and fictitious narratives, with true ones corresponding to what in the West would be called myths. So next slide, please. So now I will discuss the examples of myths. So number one is fables. The word fable derives from the Latin word fabula, which originally meant about the same as the Greek mythos. Like mythos, it came to mean a fictitious or untrue story. Myths, in contrast, are not presented as fictitious or untrue. Fables, like some myths, feature personified animals or natural objects as characteristics. Unlike myths, however, fables almost always end up with an explicit moral message, and this highlights the characteristics feature of fables, namely that they are instructive tales that teach morals and about human social behavior. Myths, by contrast, tend to lack this directly didactic aspect, and the secret narratives that they embody are often hard to translate into directive perceptions for action in everyday human terms. Another difference between fables and myths relates to a feature of the narratives that they present. So next slide, please. So fairy tales, the term fairy tale. So again, fairy tales, the term fairy tale can refer only to stories about fairies, a class of supernatural and sometimes malevolent beings, often believed to be diminutive size, who were thought by people in medieval and post-medieval Europe to inhabit a kingdom of their own. A literary expression of this belief can be found in William Shakespeare. A Midsummer's Night's Dream. Like myths, fairy tales present extraordinary and beings and events. Unlike myths, but like fables, fairy tales tend to be placed in a setting that is geographically and temporally vague and might begin with the words, "Once upon a time there was a handsome prince." So next slide, please. Next one is the folk tales. There is much disagreement among scholars as how to define the folktale. Consequently, there is a disagreement about the relation between folktale and myth. One view of the problem is that of the American folklorist Steve Thompson, who regarded myths as one of type of folktale. According to this approach, the particular characteristics of myth is that its narratives deal with secret events that happened in the beginning. So next slide, please. So we will talk about the saga and epics. So the word saga is often used in generalized and loose way to refer to any extended narrative recreation of historical events. A distinction is thus sometimes drawn between myths and sagas. This rather vague use of saga is best avoided. However, since the word can more usefully retain the precise connotation of its original text, the word saga is Old Norse and means what is said. So next slide, please. So legends. In common usage, the word legend usually characterizes a traditional tale to have a historical basis, as in the legends of King Arthur or Robin Hood. In this view, a distinction may be drawn between myth and legend. Thus, some writers on the Iliad would distinguish between legendary aspects and mythical aspects. So next slide, please. So the last one is the parables. The term myth is not normally applied to narratives that have as their explicit purpose the illustration of a doctrine or standard of conduct. Instead, the term parable or illustrative tale is used. Familiar examples of such narratives are the parables of the New Testament. Parables have a considerable role as in Sufism, Rabbinic, Hasidism, and Zen Buddhism. The parables are essentially non-mythological is clear because the point made by the parable is known or supposed to be known from other source. So that would be all about myth. Now I will give the platform for Mr. By the way, I forgot. So before I will end my discussion about the myths, I'm go. So before I end my discussion about the myths, I will give you a saying. So a myth is a way of making sense in a senseless world. Myths are narrative patterns that give significance to our existence. So that would be all about my part. Now I will give the platform to Mr. Kanyal to further discuss his topic. That would be all. Thank you.
So a pleasant day once again. I am Nathaniel Sikanyel and I will continue the discussion of our group. So I am going to discuss the Vita Activa or called as Hannah Arendt. So the human condition first published in 1958 is Hannah Arendt's account of how human activities should be and have been understood throughout Western history. Ardet is interested in the vita activa, active life, as contrasted with the vita contemplativa or contemplative life, and concerned that the debate over the relative status of the two has blinded us to important insights about the vita activa and the way in which it has changed since ancient times. So, the human condition Ardet introduced the term vita activa or active life by distinguishing it from vita contemplativa or contemplative life. Asian philosophers insisted upon the superiority of the vita contemplativa, for which the vita active merely provided necessities. So, the public and the private realm. According to Ardet, ancient Greek life was divided between two realms: the public realm in which action was performed, and the private realm site of the household ruled by its head. The mark of the private was not intimacy, as it is in modern times, but biological necessity. In the private realm, heads of household took care of needs for food, shelter, and sex. By contrast, the public realm was the realm of freedom from these biological necessities, a realm in which one could distinguish oneself through great words and great deeds. Labor. Arendt claims that her distinction between labor and work has been disregarded by philosophers throughout history, even though it has been preserved in many European languages. Labor is human activity directed at meeting biological and perhaps other necessities for self-preservation and the reproduction of the species. Because these needs cannot be satisfied once and for all, labor never really reaches an end. Its fruits do not last long. They are quickly consumed and more must always be produced. Work. Work, unlike labor, has a clearly defined beginning and end. It leaves behind a durable object such as a tool rather than an object for consumption. These durable objects become part of the world we live in. Work involves an element of violation or violence in which the worker interrupts nature in order to obtain and shape raw materials. For example, a tree is cut down to obtain wood, or the earth is mined to obtain metals. Work comprises the whole process, from the original idea for the subject to, to the obtaining of raw materials to the finished product. The process of work is determined by the categories of means and end. Arendt thinks that thinking of ourselves primarily as workers leads to a sort of instrumental reasoning in which it is natural to think of everything as a potential means to some further end. Action. The third type of activity, action, which includes both speech and action, is the means by which humans themselves do others, not that action is always consensually guiding such disclosure. Indeed, the self revealed in action is more than likely concealed from the person acting, revealed only in the story of her action. Action is the means by which we distinguish ourselves from others as unique and unchangeable beings. With humans, unlike with other beings, there is not just a generic question of what we are, but who, but of who each is individually. Action and speech are always between humans and directed toward them, and it generates human relationships. The Vita Activa and the Modern Age. Arendt thinks that the three great events determined the character of the modern age: the discovery of America and the ensuing exploration of the whole earth. The Reformation, which by explorating ec- ecclesiastical and monastic possessions started the twofold process of individual exploration and the accumulation of special wealth, the invention of the telescope and the development of a new science that considers the nature of the earth from the viewpoint of the universe. ISA and RSA by Louis Althusser. Althusser is a structuralist Marxist. Althusser makes this distinction in his essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, which discusses the relation between the state and its subjects. Althusser mentions two major mechanisms for ensuring that people within the state behave according to the rules of the state, even when it's not in their best interest in regard to their class positions to do so. The first is what Althusser calls the RSA, or repressive state apparatuses, that can enforce behavior directly, such as the police and the criminal justice system. Althusser's answer starts with a distinction between ideologies and ideology. Ideologies are specific, historical, and differing. We can talk about various ideologies, such as Christian ideology, democratic ideology, feminist ideology, and Marxist ideology. Now we have Kitsch, Clement Greenberg, avant-garde, avant-garde, and kitsch are contrasting concepts of art. These two concepts prevailed in the art were during a trivial time in history for artists. During this time, there was no single religion, tradition, or authority that flourished, nor would it be question of validity. This made trying times for artists of this era because artists really of this except wait a minute. So let me continue. So this made trying times for artists of this era because artists rely on these exact subjects to construct art appealing to a particular audience. For the first time in decades, would the idea of what acceptable art would be questioned. So let's move on. We have simulacra and simulation. Is a 1981 philosophical treatise by the sociologist Jean Baudrillard, in which the author seeks to examine the relationship between reality, symbols, and society, in particular the significations and symbolism of culture and media involved in constructing an understanding of shared existence. Pastiche, Postmodern Literature by Frederick Jameson, postmodern literature's celebratory mode of experimentation found new impetus with the usage of parody and pastiche. While a parody imitates the manner, style, or characteristic of a particular literary work, genre, author, and deflates the original by applying the imitation to a lowly or inappropriate subject. Pastiche literally means to combine or paste together with multiple elements. Every Day by Michael de Sartre. The Practice of Everyday Life is a book by Michael de Certeau that examines the way in which people individualize mass culture, altering things from the utilitarian objects to street plans to rituals, laws, and language in order to make them their own. It was originally published in French as L'invention du quotidien. The practice of everyday life begins by pointing out that while social science possess the ability to study the traditions, language, symbols, art, and articles of the exchange that makes up a culture, it lacks a formal means by which to examine the ways in which people reappropriate them in everyday situations. So that will be all for our peer activity, which is all about the enumeration and discussion about neoliberalism, myth, and Vita Active using our Zoom application. So thank you for listening. Hope you learned something and have a nice day. Goodbye.